Good evening, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is the CLA Racial Justice Committee in conjunction with the Charles Houston Bar Association, California Association of Black Lawyers, and the Alameda County Bar Association's Town Hall on reparations, something that is much more than financial. My name is Adrianette Ciccone, and I am one of the chairs of the Racial Justice Committee. This evening, you will hear from my fellow co-chair, Terrence Evans, and Professor Nicholas Baham, at the Cal State University of East Bay. I will be providing a brief introduction on Professor Baham and Terrence, and we will then see a magnificent video that Professor Baham has graciously prepared for us, and we will get the discussion going. So with that, I will begin. Dr. Nicholas L. Baham III is a professor of ethnic studies at California State University, East Bay, and teaches courses in Black studies and genders and sexualities in communities of color. Dr. Baham is a San Francisco native. He attended college at the University of Chicago, where he earned a bachelor's degree in political science, earned his master's degree in anthropology at Stanford University, and received his PhD in anthropology at Indiana University, Bloomington. His academic research focuses on African American religious experience, sexuality, and artistic expression. His book, The Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice, was published in 2015 by the McFarland Press. He has a growing body of published journal articles and book chapters on the Coltrane Church, an African American musical and religious expression, James Baldwin, and critical media literacy, including I Know You Know, Esperanza Spalding's Hybrid, Intertextual, Multilingual, Relevant Jazz Aesthetic, Radio Free Coltrane, Free Jazz Radio as Revolutionary Practice in America, the Journal of American Popular Culture, and a co-authored chapter entitled The New American Authoritarianism, How the Corporate Media Normalized Fascism in 2016, published in Project Censored in 2018. As part of his growing academic interest in Afrofuturism, Dr. Baham served as an editor of the Journal of Future Studies Special 2019 edition entitled When is Wakanda? Afrofuturism and Dark Speculative Futurity. He has presented his work nationally and internationally at the American University in Paris, Université Paul Valéry in Montpellier, Stanford University, University of Pennsylvania, Tuskegee, and Suffolk University. Dr. Baham is a co-host for the Along the Line podcast for Project Censored and has appeared on BET, local KPOO, and KPFA radio. And one that is difficult for me to pronounce, so I'm going to pass that one on. And the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, Pitchforkazine, Canada's Sex TV, and in Color Lines and Esquire magazines. He is also a board member of the Media Freedom Foundation for Project Censored. He has a blog of African American politics and culture called The Upper Room at nicholasbaham.blogspot.com. At Cal State East Bay, Dr. Baham teaches courses on Afrofuturism, jazz cultures, Black sexualities, James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and racialized masculinities. Among his many faculty governance responsibilities, Dr. Baham served 2 terms as chapter president for the California Faculty Association and is currently serving as campus diversity equity liaison officer and chair of the Faculty Diversity and Equity Committee. Welcome so much. We're so happy to have you here, Dr. Baham. Terrence J. Evans is a partner in the San Francisco and Los Angeles offices of Duane Morris LLP, where he serves as vice chair of the firm's banking practice for the Western U.S. and co-chair of the Duane Morris San Francisco Diversity and Inclusion Committee. His practice is focused on representing the financial services industry, which includes international, national, and community banks, loan service companies, and insurance companies. During his career, Terrence has recovered and saved clients of the firm tens of millions of dollars in settlements, judgments, and extrajudicial procedures. Terrence is the chair of the litigation section of the California Lawyers Association, vice president of the Charles Houston Bar Association, the co-chair of the ABA ICLC Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and executive board member of the Bar Association of San Francisco, co-founder of the CLA Racial Justice Committee, deputy director of the Region 9 of the National Bar Association, and an advisory board member of the Minority Corporate Counsel Association. Terrence has received numerous awards and honors during his career. Terrence, thank you so much. I don't know how you do it all, but you do it all. And just, reading your resume is awesome, just for me. So now with that, Professor Baham, do you want to introduce the video that you graciously prepared before we show it?
Yeah, so I wanted to put together a short video presentation. There's just as a way to start our discussion. It provides some sense of the historical case for reparations and the history of African Americans in particular working towards reparations for slavery in this context. I've got a couple of recommendations that come at the end, and we can discuss those. And then there are some important points to be made about why some reparations were given in non-African American contexts and excuses that have been made for not giving reparations in the African American context. So let's roll tape, as we used to say in the 20th century.
Thanks so much.
To our discussion of the historical case for reparations. I'm Dr. Nicholas Louis Baham III. I'm a professor of ethnic studies at California State University, East Bay, and I teach Black studies and genders and sexualities in communities of color. Here's a picture of me so that you have a face to go along with the voice that you are hearing. Let's ask, what are reparations? They can present history and knowledge as it really happened. They can offer reconciliation with the past in the form of monetary payments or land grants. They can be spiritual, cultural, educational, or offer economic repair, and they can assist with the building of institutions. Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapough Lenape Nation says, perhaps the most important thing that reparations can do is present history and knowledge as it really occurred, not as a paradigm to abuse and manipulate. Reparations, I think, has to start with the integrity of true history. Columnist Noah Millman has said that reparations can be an attempt to reconcile with the past between communities where one has suffered at the hands of the other, whether that is in the form of monetary or whatever. It is an intracommunal agreement, effectively, that what we are doing now is settling a long-standing grievance. L. Joy Williams, president of the NAACP's Brooklyn chapter, has said, we're still uncovering stories and places of what harm was done, and that is part of reparations. Following that is how we do repair. How do we repay? That need not always take the form of a check. She said further, if you're relying on the American government to come and chart out a process for reparations, we'll be waiting for 400 more damn years for that to happen. The overall process we're talking about starts with telling the truth. That can come from professors researching, that can come from elected officials uncovering documents, that can come from a Ta-Nehisi Coates writing. That doesn't have to happen from the government, and I don't think it should. Let's make our historical case for reparations as monetary payments, land grants, and the acknowledgement of the true history of events. Let's start with the 13th Amendment. Now, we know that while the 13th Amendment abolished chattel slavery in the United States in 1865, with the exception of prison, it made no provision for restitution to the formerly enslaved population, which numbered approximately 4 million. The policy, popularly referred to as 40 acres and a mule, a promise by the federal government to redistribute land that had been confiscated, was immediately overturned by Andrew Johnson, who reestablished Southern rule. Johnson vetoed a bill that Congress sent to his desk that would have formalized the allocation of land to newly freed Black people as reparations. With the end of government support for land going to free people, a sharecropping system arose in its place, leaving them economically destitute. Now, sharecropping was a fairly sophisticated system of debt whereby a sharecropper would be provided with land and seed, and in exchange, he would promise the landowner half of his crop. It kept people in a debt cycle. In a letter to Democratic politician Walter Vaughn of Iowa in 1890, Frederick Douglass marveled that the American government had failed to compensate Black people for 250 years of unpaid labor, which included building the Capitol and White House. He said the Egyptian bondsman went out with the spoils of his master, and the Russian serf was provided with farming tools and 3 acres of land upon which to begin life. But the Negro has neither spoils, implements, nor lands, and today he is practically a slave on the very plantation where he formerly was driven to toil under the lash. The ex-slave pension bill was introduced in Congress at Vaughn's request. The concept of an ex-slave pension was based on the post-Civil War program for disabled veterans, including Blacks, which was established by the Bureau of Pensions. Vaughn articulated his pro-reparations views in a pamphlet titled Vaughn's Freedmen's Pension Bill, being an appeal in behalf of men released from slavery. He argued that reparations were equally beneficial to Blacks and whites, because the system would provide economic justice. Vaughn's advocacy for ex-slave pensions fueled the national debate on reparations and gave rise to numerous organizations during the last decade of the 19th century. But none of these were more prominent than the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association, which historian Mary Frances Berry has called one of the largest grassroots movements in African American history. That movement was led by a woman. The woman who led that movement was Callie House, a seamstress, washerwoman, widow, mother of 5, and former slave turned activist. The association aimed to provide mutual aid and burial expenses and to lobby Congress to enact legislation that would compensate the formerly enslaved, especially the elderly, for their unpaid years of labor. If the government had the right to free us, House stated, she, the U.S., had a right to make some provision for us, and since she did not make it soon after emancipation, she ought to make it now. In 1899, the first bill introduced on behalf of the association in both houses of Congress was simply titled A Bill to Provide Pensions for Freedmen and so forth. By the early 20th century, according to government figures, the MRB and PA had an estimated 300,000 members, all demanding a law ordering reparations for slavery. The pushback against Callie House was overwhelming. The post office used its anti-fraud powers against the movement, issuing a fraud order against House in September 1899. And though Callie House fought back, the harassment continued as notices were issued to local post offices ordering them to deny any money orders made out to the association or its officials. This campaign against House continued for almost 2 decades. In Johnson v. McAdoo, which was the first documented federal litigation for reparations, the class action suit started from the idea that had been taken as a cotton tax that was actually owed to the people who had produced that cotton. The district court in the nation's capital and the U.S. Supreme Court on appeal held that the U.S. was safeguarded against such suits. This is a suit that Callie House specifically brought against the federal government. And there were repercussions of this suit. In 1917, House was arrested, convicted of mail fraud, and jailed. The reparations movement remained on life support until 1922, when the government finally succeeded in shutting it down. And in 1995, the Johnson v. McAdoo rationalization was repeated when African-American plaintiffs under the collective name Cato attempted to sue the United States for reparations in the U.S. District Court. Again, a judge claimed U.S. immunity. There was the unique case of Henrietta Wood, a formerly enslaved woman who sued for restitution and won. In 1853, Wood was a free black woman living and laboring as a domestic worker in Cincinnati when she was lured across the Ohio River and into the slave state of Kentucky by a white man named Zebulon Ward. Ward sold her to slave traders who took her to Mississippi. A cotton planter bought her there and later took her to Texas, where she remained enslaved through the Civil War. Now, Wood eventually returned to Cincinnati, and in 1870, she sued Ward for $20,000 in damages and lost wages. In 1878, an all-white jury decided in Wood's favor, and Ward was ordered to pay $2,500, perhaps the largest sum ever awarded by a court in the United States in restitution for slavery. Let's look at some other historical examples of reparations. We know that there were reparations given for American Indian genocide. For example, after World War II, Congress created the Indian Claims Commission to pay compensation to any federally recognized tribe for land that had been seized by the United States. The group's mission was complicated by a paucity of written records, difficulties in putting a value on the land for its agricultural productivity or religious significance, and problems with determining boundaries and ownership for decades. The commission paid out about $1.3 billion, the equivalent of less than $1,000 for each Native American in the United States at that time. Congress listened to the claims of the tribal leaders, however, but they took a paternalistic view and kept Native Americans from having direct control of the funds in the belief that they were not competent to receive such large sums of money. As a separate agreement that was struck with Congress in 1971, there was an award that led to $962 million worth of land in Alaska, some 44 million acres, in return for Indians, Eskimos, and Aleuts relinquishing their Aboriginal claims to the rest of the state. And once again, the compensation was not directly awarded. For victims of forced sterilization in 2013, North Carolina became the first state in the country to pass a law intended to compensate the surviving victims among the 7,600 people who were sterilized under a decades-long eugenics program. There was a $10 million fund set up to compensate them. But there were naturally conflicts that arose over who was eligible, and a state commission and state courts denied claims from the relatives of those who were injured. There were reparations for Japanese internment. The Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948 offered compensation for real and personal property that they had lost. About $37 million was paid to 26,000 claimants, but no provision was made for lost freedom or violated rights. That came in 1998 when Congress voted to extend an apology. Counseling and education was also part of making amends for police abuses in Chicago. The men who survived brutal treatment by Chicago police commander and his midnight crew of detectives wanted more than money. As a part of the $5.5 million reparations measure enacted by the city, Chicago also agreed to compensate 57 victims who said that the police had beaten, shocked, suffocated, and psychologically tortured them. Students in Chicago were also allowed to learn about police torture in their classes. And then there's the matter of Rosewood. An apology was issued for a Florida massacre, but the money didn't go far. More than 70 years after a racist mob massacred black residents, some of them, in particular Lizzie Jenkins' mother, received $3,333.33 as recompense. Florida did agree to a reparations package worth around $3.36 million in 2014 dollars, of which $2.4 million today would compensate each individual. And there was the Tuskegee experiment. After the end of the Tuskegee experiment, in which 399 black men with syphilis were left untreated to study the progression of the disease between 1932 and 1972, the government reached a $10 million out-of-court settlement with the victims and their families in 1974. This included also a promise of lifelong medical treatment for participants and their immediate families. And of course, our most celebrated example of reparations is perhaps the Holocaust. A major component of this was $7 billion that West Germany agreed to give to the then young state of Israel, which helped with infrastructure. But Germany's total reparations payments totaled nearly $89 billion as of 2012 and largely went to individual survivors. These reparations are negotiated by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims against Germany. South Africa's Post-Apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended $36 million in reparations to be distributed in 6 annual payments to victims identified by the commission. But in 2003, President Thabo Mbeki announced that he would authorize only $85 billion to be given in one-time payments of $3,900. The recipients numbered 16,397 as of 2012. That's a tiny fraction of those who were subjected to apartheid. Now, my recommendations are that we should consider the possibility that reparations should be based on Jim Crow segregation in addition to the era of enslavement, and that reparations should include money and land grants, including a reexamination of the land originally confiscated from slaveholders and land marked by racial violence in the Jim Crow era, as well as the fact that I think that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act should become amendments to the United States Constitution. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic and for engaging this particular presentation and for building towards the possibility of reparation.
Thank you so much for preparing that for us, Professor Bayham. That was really great. And as I told you when we did our run through, I really like the hand of color and I like the graphics in there. That's really important because often in the educational system, people of color don't always see people that are teaching them or professors that look like them. And why don't we see a lot of professors of color? Because there's a lot of racial inequities. How do we balance inequities? Reparations, right? That can help. So that's what this is really about. Ellen says thank you as well.
Thank you,
Next, we will hear from, well, actually, Professor Bayham, if you wanted to add anything to that, you can. And if not, we can go to Terrence and then you can talk more after, whatever you
Well,
prefer.
yeah, I'd like us to go to Terrence, but I do want to make one correction on the South African slide. I think I said 36 million. It was 360 billion that was proposed, and their president authorized only 80 some odd billion of that 360 billion. But I think what I wanted to emphasize in this, and we can talk about this more with Terrence, is that there's a history of Black agency in attempting to secure reparations, and there are actually minor events in American history, whether that's Rosewood or that's Tuskegee or Chicago in police violence, in which reparations have been offered, as well as Henrietta's case where they were individually offered to her. 2,500, but look, I guess you'll take it at that point in time, given that you have an all-white jury. So, but with that, I'll talk about some other things after Terrence.
And actually, a good friend and colleague, James Cook, who does civil rights law with the illustrious John Burris in Oakland, California, says, awesome, where can we get that video? So James wants the video, but I'll connect you afterwards.
Awesome.
we
Thank
see
you.
you, James. So Terrence, thank you again for being here. We appreciate you and all that you do for everyone, CLA, CHBA, cable, the NBA. I mean, there's everything. BASF, all these things. You do everything. So we appreciate you. So in terms of this evening's presentation, I know that our title is Reparations More Than Financial, and in Professor Bayham's video, we talked about financial reparations, and I believe the gentlemen that were subjected to the Tuskegee experiment also were going to be able to receive some reparations in the form of health care for them, I believe, and their families. But Terrence, can you speak to us about how, or the fact that reparations are based on more than just the period of enslavement? Black people, brown people continue to be marginalized due to things like institutional racism, institutional inequity, over policing, homelessness, and even when we're looking at COVID, the people who are dying the most are Black and brown people. And I don't think that that's any coincidence, being that both groups have been marginalized in society. So Terrence, if you could please speak to the expansion of reparations.
Certainly. And are you able to hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay, thank
loud and
you.
clear.
I appreciate it. And I want to thank Professor Baham for that incredible video and that amazing lesson that he provided regarding the history that has gotten to us to where we are. I think it's also important to talk about, in companion with that, the systematic racism that supports the argument for reparations, because I think when many folks have conversations about reparations, many of them are only looking at slavery. And as you pointed out so correctly in the video that you put together, we need to look at the totality of the systematic racism against Black people and also people of color. And I'd like to briefly just talk about some of that systematic racism in California. I think a lot of folks, when they talk about systematic racism, when they talk about Jim Crow, when they talk about the oppression of Black people and other people of color, they often are thinking about states in the South. They're not thinking that California and other states in the North or the West were part of that, but they were. And so here in California, the first governor of California was Peter Burnett. And he made a number of comments as California was becoming a new state about his desire to make California a safe place for white people. And he specifically worked very hard to pass laws that would limit the number of people of color in the state and limit the rights of Blacks, Native Americans, and Asians. And some of the laws that he helped to pass that were in effect for 100 years in the state of California limited people of color and Blacks in particular in the following ways. Black people and non-whites were barred from testifying in any case where a white person was a party. So if you were in a car accident, if you had a slip and fall, it didn't matter what it was. If you were the victim of crime, if you were the victim of rape, and you were a person of color in the state of California for 100 years, you could not testify against a white person. It barred non-whites from serving on a jury. So we talk about jury service, and if we think back to the vice presidential debate, it was an interesting contrast because you had Vice President Pence talking about his offense at the concept of systematic racism, and you had Kamala Harris specifically speaking to examples of systematic racism. Well, here in the great state of California, non-whites could not serve on juries. Non-whites could not vote in California. When we talk about the importance of voting rights and voter suppression, again, many people are always thinking about the South. Oh, that's something that happened in Mississippi or Alabama or some of those states. No, it happened here in California. For 100 years, people of color could not vote. People of color could not hold elective office. You couldn't be dog catcher, you couldn't be mayor, you couldn't be a senator, you couldn't be a congressperson, you couldn't be anything in the state of California for 100 years if you were a person of color. People of color could not serve as judges in California. For 100 years, you could not be a judge. It's quite remarkable that we have Justice Martin Jenkins being nominated by our governor to serve on the California Supreme Court, only the third African-American man and also the first LGBT person to serve on the court. But for 100 years, essentially, in California, from 1850 to 1947, you could not serve as any jurist in California. People of color were barred from questioning white witnesses if you were an attorney. So if you were a lawyer and one of the witnesses happened to be white, you were prohibited from asking them any questions. And you can imagine how limiting that is. If you are defending a person, if you are serving as a plaintiff's counsel, if you're a prosecutor, it didn't matter. A white witness did not have to answer questions from a lawyer of color. This is systematic racism, 100 years, California. Non-whites were barred from public schools. We talk about the efforts to desegregate public schools in many parts of the South, but schools in California were segregated and essentially are segregated. I went to segregated schools in California. The schools that I went to were largely Black and Hispanic, and we still have mostly segregated schools in the United States. We don't have white-only signs, but the way folks are allowed to go to public schools based on where they live and based on the opportunities they have, these schools are still segregated. The school that I went to Inglewood High School in particular, the history books that we had were more than 20 years old. So if you wanted to be prepared for the AP exam, like myself, I had to go to the public library so I could supplement the information I could not get in school. We didn't have computers in my high school. We had a teacher that would stand up there and talk about what would happen if we had a computer. That's what's happening now in 2020 in many predominantly Black and brown schools. Non-whites were barred from buying and renting property. So you had a number of neighborhoods that were redlined, and it's still happening today, where if you were Black, you could not buy in certain areas. You could not buy. There were codes that prevented you. We actually had a proposition that passed in California. It was Proposition 14 that prevented folks from being able to buy property. You could not get a loan. So if you wanted to buy a house in a predominantly white neighborhood, you could not get a loan to buy property. You couldn't rent in certain areas. There was no Fair Housing Act in place. It's important to note that the current administration has gutted the Fair Housing Act, and they have removed the protections that were available to complain about this type of racism. If you were not white, you couldn't be buried in certain cemeteries. I grew up in Inglewood, California, which is now about 50% Black and little 50% Hispanic. The Inglewood Cemetery, which is one of the largest cemeteries in the United States, barred Black people from being buried there. We had to fight for the right to be buried there. And I'm proud to say that I have a family that were able to break that color barrier. If you were Black or a person of color in California, I keep reminding people that we're talking about California. For 100 years, you couldn't go to restaurants. You could not go to hotels. You could not go to theaters. You could not use public swimming pools. You could not use beaches in California for 100 years. This was throughout the country, but I'm talking about California. I remember my grandmother telling me a story about her and my uncles when they were kids. They went to a drive-through. My dad and his brothers, they were very young and they were craving cheeseburgers. So they went through a drive-through. Blacks were not allowed on the inside, but my grandmother said, you know what, we'll go through the drive-through. And when they got up to the window to pay after having placed their order, they were told very rudely, we don't serve in here. You know, you can fill in the blank there. So Black people couldn't even go to the drive-through in California. Black people were denied admission to bar associations. Folks wonder, why do we have all of these affinity bar associations? Why do we have Charles Houston? Why do we have East Bay La Raza? Why do we have the Asian Pacific American Bar Association? Why do we have all these ethnic bar associations? Is because the American Bar Association and local city and state bar association refused admission of people of color. So it didn't matter that you had gone to law school. It didn't matter that you were competent, that you were ready. You could not be part of the bar association. You were denied, if you were a person of color, the access to public transportation in California. You were denied equal pay for equal work. What does that mean? If you were a trash collector, and you were a person of color, you got paid less than whites, and you also earned seniority at a slower rate than white folks. This is systematic racism. A lot of folks also don't understand that when the Civil Rights Act was passed, that included in part of the negotiations was that people of color would not earn seniority at the same rate as whites. And I'm just about done here. There were also laws that prohibited people of color from marrying a white. So you had this whole system in place that limited the ability of people of color, Black folks in particular, to earn equity, to earn wealth, to buy houses, to have houses appreciate at the same rate as houses in white areas, denied them the access to education. And so for all of these reasons, you have the economic disparities that we still see today. This was not that long ago. And this is part of the case that we're making for reparations. It's not just slavery. It's the whole system of suppression and oppression that people of color and Blacks in particular endured. There are other examples here, and I don't want to hog all the time, but there were two cases in particular that I thought were of note that were decided by the California Supreme Court. And I'll give the citation for this first case. It's People versus Hall. It was decided in 1854, and the citation is 4 Cal 39. It was written by the youngest Chief Justice ever of the California Supreme Court, which was Hugh C. Murray. And in this case, they were trying to make a determination regarding what would qualify as Black and who would have certain rights under the California Constitution. They also, in this particular case, it involves some Chinese migrants. One of them had witnessed one of their friends being murdered by a white man, and there were laws that specifically that banned folks of Indian descent, Negro, or Black from testifying against whites. And the issue was whether or not somebody of Chinese descent was barred by those same laws. And ultimately, the holding was the words Indian, Negro, Black, and white are generic terms designating race, and therefore Chinese and all other people who are not white are included in the prohibition of being witnesses against whites. So they expanded the discrimination to include people of color. And there's one other case that I'll just mention briefly, because I think this is another example of the institutional racism that is part of the legal system and has been for some time. This is People versus Elyeya. This is ELYEA, 1859 case. The citation is 14 Cal 144. And in this case, you had someone of Turkish descent who had Caucasian features, but they were dark-skinned. And the issue was whether or not somebody who had Caucasian features but dark skin would be barred from being able to testify as a witness against a white person. And ultimately, they decided that if you had Caucasian features and dark skin, you were competent to testify. But if you had Afrocentric features like myself, you were not competent to testify. So in other words, if you're a white person and you got a suntan, you stayed out on the beach, you're not going to lose your right to testify against other white folks. But if you have Afrocentric features, such as myself, you were then barred. So you can see how they're splitting hairs here, but there's a whole body of law in California that has been a part of the systematic oppression of Black folks and other people of color. So thank you for this opportunity to give some of this history, and I certainly want to bring the rest of the panelists back so we can have further discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Terrence. I appreciate you laying out why reparations are really needed and necessary for more than just the period that African Americans were in bondage. And, you know, we do see everyone's comments to the panelists, so we appreciate those. Just to answer them in a very broad and general questions, yes, African Americans, we are discussing the history of the lack of African American reparations and the case for African American reparations. And the reason why we're bringing up other people of color in the discussion is not to say that other people of color would be included in any legal claim, just to note that in our country and in our society, people of color are often marginalized in different ways, but marginalized nonetheless. So that's the reason why we're bringing it up, not for the legal claim component, but we do appreciate it. So thank you so much for your comments and for tuning in. Now I want to ask the question, and we already touched a little bit on how other groups who have been wronged have been given reparations thus far. We spoke to the Holocaust survivors. We spoke to Japanese descendants of people who were, directly impacted by the Japanese internment camps. We haven't really talked so much about Indigenous Americans. So Professor Baham, do you want to talk a little bit about that and how Indigenous Americans have been given reparations thus far?
I do have one example in the video that I give. American Indian Studies isn't my field. I do have a colleague in that. Let me say the reason why I discussed different groups in my presentation is because there have been specific historical reasons for denying African Americans reparations. And if we're going to make a move for that again, we have to be aware of those denials and deal with them. The legal denial has been, generally speaking, that America has immunity. That's an odd argument to me, given the fact that we were enslaved in America. I'm not sure where the immunity comes up exactly. The other issue that I hear frequently rhetorically, particularly by folks on the right, whenever this conversation comes up is, well, first of all, how do you know who to give it to? The records are insufficient from slavery. Not everybody can trace themselves back directly to slavery. I've even heard absurd comments like, well, would somebody like Obama get reparations? His dad was from Africa and his mother was European American. There's an obvious answer to that. It's not even a question that's worth asking, frankly. But I think that when I say, look, maybe we need to think about Jim Crow as well as slavery, I think we're onto something. And I think that what you hear from Terrence about discrimination since slavery, Jim Crow, all the way up to the present. The beautiful thing about what Terrence has provided here is those things are measurable. There are real measurable values right there. You can assign $1 to them. You can assign $1 to the destruction of Tulsa, Oklahoma in a riot and the destruction of a Black business community. You can assign values to people who were held back from forms of employment or had to go through improper schooling with secondhand books in little shacks where they had to crowd together and learn. You can assign values to that, and you can more easily trace people from the Jim Crow era because, frankly, look, my grandmother lived through that. She lived to be 101 years old. She lived through that. I know what she went through. I know about the properties that she had in Texas that were burned down. There's a value to those kinds of things. And all that stuff motivated her coming out here. I know that when my mother came to San Francisco, as Terrence says, that she and my dad had to search in the newspaper for people who would rent to Negroes. I know that my mother, when she showed up for her first day at San Francisco Unified School District, was told that Blacks don't teach here. And she was given another school to work in. And I know that she was vastly underpaid, both as a woman and as an African American. So if there's any doubt about how we can trace the lineage or discern the values, we can certainly do that from Jim Crow. But I would also say that if you look at the Frederick Douglass statement in the video, Frederick Douglass is actually alluding to real property that was constructed at the hands of African Americans that has a value. So what's the monetary value of the White House? Okay, so perhaps the monetary value has gone down in the past 4 years because of the recent occupant, but it has a value to us. It has a monetary value. What's the value to, say, Monticello, Jefferson's plantation, which we can all visit and which people pay to visit and so forth. I've actually visited that plantation just to see what that looked like. What's the value of these kinds of things? And then also one of the things that I didn't mention here is that there are a host of individual histories about the potential in the early years after slavery and in the Reconstruction of formerly enslaved people being given the land and the property upon which they were enslaved, and then that being taken away from them. And there's a really good book called Repair that deals with this, and it deals with two specific plantations in which that happened. One of those is in the near the Gullah Seacoast Islands, and another one was a plantation that was owned by Jefferson Davis. So there are actually real money, even if you can't trace your way all the way back, there's real money that could be assessed. And I would love to see someone who was kind of an accountant, if you will, or had an accountant's brain, go through it, figure out what the values were then and what they are now, and what the accrued value of these things has been over the years. Because these properties that we have created and these lands and spaces, for example, what is all of Washington, D.C. worth? And that's a good question, okay? And what's the interest that is built up on the value of Washington, D.C.?
You know, in another way,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say another approach is we can look at and we can make a direct comparison between the relative wealth of Black folks in the United States, and we can compare that with the relative wealth of whites. And we can look at the disparity and we can figure out what would it take so that we have some equity here between African Americans and whites. And that could be one approach to figure out how much would be needed in order to create some type of equality, is look at the difference. I mean, it's so many ways, and I just look at my own personal, story. My mother and her brothers and sisters, none of them were born in hospitals, because where they grew up in Tennessee, Black people were barred from hospitals. I don't know if people realize how deep segregation went. If you were Black, if you were a person of color, you couldn't go to a hospital unless it was a hospital designated for people of color. So if you were in a car accident, if you broke your leg, you couldn't just go to the nearest hospital. That's why so many folks died, because they could only go to one that accepted people of color. And by the time you get there, you've bled to death. So none of them were born in hospitals because there was no Black hospital anywhere near where any of them grew up. My grandfather, he could not buy property because where he lived, and the same meant for much of California for 100 years, if you were not white, you couldn't buy property. So if you wanted to buy property, you had to get a white person that you trusted. You gave them your money and they would go buy the property for you, and you would hope they wouldn't screw you over. Many times you got screwed over. And if you got screwed over, guess what? Black folks couldn't sue white people. You couldn't testify against white people. So you could have given your entire life savings, and this happened in our family. Gave our entire life savings to a white person that we thought we could trust so that they could go buy some property so we could have for a home for our family, and they run off with the money and there is nowhere to go. There's no court, there's no police officer, there's nothing. You're just out of your life savings, and it happened a lot. So it's kind of hard to do it on a case-by-case basis, but you look at how this happened systematically, and you look at where white folks are in wealth and where Black folks are, and we just try to figure out how do we get to where we should be if we hadn't had all of the systematic racism to overcome.
Thank you so much, Terrence. There's actually a CNN series that, Lord, his name is escaping me now. What is the gentleman's name? He did a program this summer on reparations, and he went down to, that's right, someone just said Kamau Bell. Thank you.
Kamau Bell, yeah.
Yes, and he went down to New Orleans and he interviewed a lot of different people, and they discussed the same subject. And there was actually a professor, I believe he's somewhere in the Northeast, perhaps at Yale. And he actually did do, Professor Bayham, just what you were saying, like the accounting of it. So I think that the amount of money that would be required to reparate or pay back, I don't think that that is the biggest question here. I think what happens whenever I think about this myself is a lot of other groups have been given reparations. And why is it so hard for African Americans to receive reparations? It's clear that we've been discriminated against time and time again, and that the discrimination based on race, continues. And so um, that's something that I think about regularly. Professor Bayham, do you want to try to answer that if you can? Because I feel like there are
Well,
probably lots of roots. I don't know that there's just one reason.
well, first of all, it has a lot to do with, I mean, it's racism. Okay, it's just another form of expression of racism. And another expression of racism is also not recognizing that these ills happen. I mean, after all, half the country has moved on and argues that there isn't such a thing as systemic racism. I think we saw that at the vice presidential debate. You've got a whole, at least 40% of the country that argues that that wasn't there. In fact, I remember in the Reagan administration, people were arguing, racism's over. You got Michael Jackson and you got Bill Cosby. Well, yeah, that's not enough, as we can see, right? In particular, it's also a lot of money. To be frank, there's a lot to admit, and there's a lot of money. And you see right now, for example, in my profession has been affected profoundly. Although we're ignoring this, the president issued an executive order recently against teaching critical race studies, which is exactly what Terrence and I have been talking about, this examination of legal precedents and structural racism that sort of investigates all of the things that held folk back. If you can't really use a critical race theory perspective, you can't really look at the damage that Jim Crow segregation did, because it was legal segregation, right? And critical race studies asks us to look into that legal space. So there's a lot of things that this country still won't admit. There's a lot of money here. And frankly, let's face it, if we just did, as people in the chat are suggesting, which I think is correct, and obviously there have been other people who suggested this, which is to deal with the racial wealth gap, you have, I believe, successful African Americans. How many African American businesses crop up because of that? How many African American law firms crop up because of that? How much more real property and actual wealth do we have that we can now pass on generation to generation if you had a reparations payment like that? That is something that approaches getting us on an equal footing. But I don't believe that the country has ever made a commitment to putting us on equal footing. In fact, I would argue that by and large, we know this certainly this summer, if you didn't know for most of your life, we are still living in an anti-Black country. And that is what it is. It's not just through police violence and mass incarceration. It's through almost everything. It's in communities that have gone with bad water for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years and more, or communities that have had to deal with asbestos and high cancer rates, et cetera, or communities that are left open to gentrification. They're occupied by police and the residents are forced out so that others can gentrify. These processes continue. The country is anti-Black.
And if I could
So
add
maybe that's
something.
the reason why, I'm sorry, Terrence. So maybe that's the reason why our American society has so much difficulty wrapping its mind around reparations for African Americans, is just because of the large anti-Black sentiment. In the series that Kamal Bell put on was really fascinating, and I would recommend everyone watch it if they can. He did go to Georgetown University which was built by, I don't remember if it was built all by bondsmen, but at least there were a good number of people who were descendants of the bondsmen that built Georgetown. And the school, in my recollection from the presentation, publicly apologized. So I think that is a public apology is definitely a good place to start. But an even better follow up to an apology is change, right? And so when I think about reparations, I think about closing the wealth gap for sure, but I also think about increasing opportunities for elevation economically and socially. And I also just think about the freedom to be without worrying about someone harassing you, the freedom to walk in and out of various different types of stores without being questioned, without being, overly checked on or not checked on at all, right? So the reason why I think reparations are more than financial is because there are so many other things that go along with that. And so say we are able to receive financial compensation, but say that nothing else in our society changes, and say that Black people are still killed at high numbers by the police, Black people are still negatively impacted by COVID and other crises, right? That's still, in my opinion, that's not going to be enough, right? So I think that there's more to it than just closing the wealth gap. Terrence?
I wanted to make the point that slaveholders got reparations, and I don't know, and this might have been in the presentation that you had, Dr. Baham, but slaveholders, they got reparations after slavery was ended in this country, but the slaves who were free did not. So there was actually a price put on the head of the Black men and women and children that the slave owners lost, and in order to help to stabilize the slaveholders following the emancipation of the slaves, they received a payment per slave that they had under their custody, but nothing for the slaves. The other thing I wanted to talk about is I believe that anti-Black racism is so deeply seated in our American culture. I think we're the only race of people who had to pass legislation so that we could wear our hair naturally without being fired and discriminated against. There's no other race of people where if you show up to work, if you show up to school and you have hair like mine, that you can be expelled simply for being yourself. So it just shows how deeply seated. There are only two states that I'm aware, I believe New York and California, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, where there is protection for Black people wearing their natural hair. Black folks, and I believe people should wear their hair however they want it, however they feel comfortable, but nobody should be forced to change what naturally grows out of their head just to make other people comfortable. So it just shows you when there's only 2 of 50 states where we can safely be ourselves, it shows you just how deeply seated anti-Black racism is in this country. So I think we have a long way to go, and I think it's going to require more than just financial, as you said so eloquently, Adrianette. We need systematic change. We need opportunity. We need educational opportunity. We need investment in our communities for property ownership and for development. And you see the disproportionate impact that COVID has on our business community, right? More than 90% of Black businesses got none of the COVID relief funds from this administration. The funds were allocated in a disproportionate way. I believe the actual number is 97% of Black businesses that applied for COVID relief got nothing. Yet you had so many businesses that are majority owned who didn't even need the money. Multi-million-dollar corporations that didn't even need the money. They were able to take advantage of the system. So it just shows you how skewed the system is against people of color. And we have a very long way to go.
Well, thank you so much. Oh, go ahead,
No,
Terrence. I keep cutting you off, and I apologize.
No worries. No worries. But I was going to ask Professor Baham, what are some of the things that you think that we can do or should be doing so that we can try to make some change? I know as we look ahead to this election, it's going to be it's really has significant consequences for us, because if the administration doesn't change, I think we're going to continue to see the erosion of any gains that we've had in the African American community. Um, and you look at the makeup of the Supreme Court in the aftermath of RBG's death and what the Supreme Court will look like. And I believe the Senate Republicans, unfortunately, will be able to get this very conservative nominee on. What are your thoughts about what we need to do to try to make things better?
Well, first of all, I would love to see, one of the reasons why I presented Callie House here is because I would love to see another organization like hers crop up around reparations, obviously with more members. If you can get a Democratic administration into office, you're still going to need to push them. So, for example, in the chat here, and by the way, it's just the comments in the chat are wonderful, down to the nomenclature of African descendants of slavery. But someone noted in the chat that the Biden-Harris administration is putting forth these kinds of proposals around indigenous folk. And while that is certainly more than justified, because indigenous folk faced genocide, if we're going to talk about getting reparations for African Americans, it has to be on the radar of Biden-Harris. I think there's no better way to do this than to put together organizations like what Callie House put together with a specific agenda. And I would say even, and you've seen the dollar figure here in the chat, a specific dollar figure, okay? A specific apology that has to happen to African Americans, a specific system of distributing those funds and actually putting them in the hands of people rather than doing something paternalistic has been done in other cases, and other things that might involve infrastructure building around those dollars. I also like, by the way, I know we've talked a lot about money, but I also like land and real property, capital, in other words, things that we've built up. How much of America's auto industry did we build up? How much of America's railroads did we build up? Or it's, let's say it's cigarette industry, it's the liquor industry, rice growing in the South, all of these kinds of things. And we don't own any of that. But I think that there's something to be said for making a plea for specific land and capital too. But I do think you've got to put together an organization around this, and it's got to be specifically focused on this issue. I don't think it does much good if you have the issue of reparations in the hands of the NAACP or any other organization that has a bunch of other issues that it's facing. Callie House was right. Have your organization focused on reparations like a laser beam if you really want to get this.
If I could address, I've been looking at some of the comments here, and these are some good comments, and I welcome Adrianette and Professor Baham to address. So I wanted to address one comment, and we were asked, why did we set this during the Jewish Sabbath? So I apologize. We didn't intend to offend anyone. We really looked at all of our schedules. I've spoken at more than 50 events since March.
I think it's like 100, Terrence, not 50.
Yeah,
Don't downplay yourself. Thanks.
maybe it's 100, but I've spoken at more than 50 events, and this was like the first date that all of us were available at the same time. I've also had people yelling at me because we said it during the NBA Finals and the Lakers are playing. So, it's really hard. No disrespect to anybody. Thank you for all the folks who pointed out that there are now Crown Act type legislation in different parts of the country. And I don't know, Adrianette or Professor Baham, if you want to talk about, there are a number of comments here where folks seem to be unhappy that we're talking about other people of color in addition to Black folks when we're talking about reparations. I think, Professor Baham, you were using it for illustrative purposes where you were explaining how so many other folks were able to get reparations, but Black folks haven't. But I see a lot of comments where folks are not very happy about lumping other people from different backgrounds in when we're talking about Black.
Right. And so just so everyone's clear, as I said earlier on in this presentation, the reason why we were discussing other people of color is just to note that they have been marginalized as well. But the research that we have presented primarily focuses on the reparations for people, African American descendants of bondsmen. I don't like to use the word slave. It just bothers me. So I try to say bondsman if possible, bondsman, bondswoman, what have you. But, you know, at the end of the day, this is something that at least I can say I'm proud that Governor Newsom has worked on. We are happy to have someone who I believe said did research and helped perhaps author, if I'm not misspeaking, AB 3121 in California. And to my understanding, that is something that is being studied at the moment. The governor is taking it seriously. Shirley Weber, who I believe is an assemblywoman down in San Diego County, has taken it very seriously as well. And so I'm really interested and excited to see what comes of it. To my understanding, it's under the research phase, but that's definitely a step in the right direction. And just let me just add one other thing too. So we, as CLA and the other bar associations that are sponsoring this, the point of this is to be educational and to be a resource for not only our members, but the community. But we also are very, very much on not being partisan. So, you know, we're a nonpartisan organization. We're just here to present the facts, and people can choose whoever or however they like. So let me just add that. And now I want to, since we know that we have a reparations bill that's being researched in California, I want to share what the legislative and policy group that CLA's Racial Justice Committee has done. They have advocated on behalf of Assemblywoman, or we have advocated on behalf of Assemblywoman Weber's bill to create this reparations task force. And, you know, it was just signed into law last week. So we are working on the cutting edge of these issues. And what AB 3121 does, just to refresh everyone's memory, is that it establishes an 8-member task force to study the issue of reparations for African Americans, propose ways to educate the California public about its findings, make recommendations on the forms that we've been talking about that reparations might take. And once that's done, the group will submit a report of its finding to the legislature as specified. So, you know, things are happening. I don't know that they'll ever happen as fast as anyone would like them to, but that's the nature of the world that we live in at present. But I'm at least happy that something is moving forward. With that, you know, we talked a little bit about who reparations would be given to or should be given to. Terrence, I know you forwarded me the article that our alma mater, I don't know if it was produced by Cornell or if someone that graduated from Cornell produced it, but it was really interesting because it discussed reparations amongst the African diasporic community. And so I think I've seen some messages in the chat being very specific on the nomenclature, saying African or American descendants of slaves, and reparations wouldn't be necessarily geared to Africans. Terrence, do you want to speak to that a little bit, since we had conversations back and forth about this?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's important that folks understand that we're not talking about giving handouts to Black folks. We're talking about equity. We're talking about equality. We're talking about righting systematic oppression and discrimination against Black folks. And that is what we're talking about when we're talking about reparations. We're trying to right a wrong, a historic wrong. And, you know, I really don't know that it's all that important when we look at the African diaspora. If we have people to show up with an ancestry and me test to show that they can trace their lineage back to a slave on a particular plantation. I think that Black folks in general in this country have suffered systematic discrimination. The laws that I referred to you just a few minutes ago in California, it applied to all Black folks. It oppressed all Black people regardless of where your lineage was from. They didn't make any distinctions if you were from Jamaica or if you were from the Ivory Coast or if you were from South Carolina. If you had Black skin in California, this is what your oppression was. So, I think it's important to look more at the bigger picture and how can we lift a community that has been oppressed for over 400 years in this country. And I think that is the kind of conversation we should have. I'm encouraged by what Governor Newsom has done. And I'm also encouraged by what Professor Baham talked about, having property, having ownership. I don't think just handing cash out to people is the answer. We need to figure out a systematic way where we can educate our people. We can provide our people with land, with power, so that they can rise up and they can take control of their own communities and take advantage of the resources that we help build. And I don't think enough focus is put on the fact that Black folks helped build this country. We built this country. If it wasn't for slavery, if it wasn't for hundreds of years of free labor, there would not be a United States of America. It is only because of the free labor that this country took advantage of for hundreds of years that we are where we are today. And there should be something done to recognize that effort and to pay our people back and to give us the opportunity to have equality that we have been denied for so long. So that's really how I see this. We're not looking for handouts. We're looking to get what we should have already had. All of the seniority that Black folks were denied for over 100 years in this country, working the same job, not getting the same benefits, not being able to take advantage. If you look back during the Great Depression, Black folks were not able to take advantage of all the new deal programs, the Social Security, the Medicare. Black folks were denied all of that, all of the pensions, all of this economic suppression that we have had to endure. It is time for something to be done about it. And I'm amazed that we survived all of that. How did Black folks survive the Great Depression without having access to all the resources that were available to white Americans? How did we survive without Social Security? How did we survive without Medicare? How did we survive without GI benefits after putting our lives on the line to defend this country? How did we survive? It is in so many different areas that we've been oppressed, and people don't really have that conversation. So we want to be paid for everything that we have been denied for years, right? That is what we're asking for. My father was one of the folks that helped desegregate the military. Where was his GI Bill? I mean, that's what I'm talking about, and that's what Black folks are talking about. So you have to look broadly at how we have been systematically impacted by this.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for bringing it to your life, Terrence. I mean, it goes without saying that being a Black American, African American, however you would like to call yourself, a descendant of slaves, right? Unfortunately, we don't have the same chances. We don't have the same, what's the right word? We may not always have the same experience, exposure. But as you said, we have survived and we've made it. And so another point that must be brought to the discussion is that, being an African-American person, in order to survive in this country, in this society, really in the world, you have to be exceptional, right? You can't just be average and make it. You have to be above and beyond. And so even workplace, educationally, all these different spheres, you have to always be, above and beyond. And so whenever people make the argument that we do live in a post-racial society because our former president is an African-American person, he's exceptional, right? He graduated from Harvard. Harvard didn't even look at my law school application, right? So we have to think about the hard work that we put in, our ancestors put in, and the future will have to put in, just so we can sort of try to be on some sort of level footing. And the exceptionalism is actually hard, right? So working hard, working long hours, doing all these things just to try to make it. I mean, it's hard. I mean, even when I look at you and all the things that you do, you're super exceptional, right? You do above and beyond. I doubt, and I don't know, just because I don't know everyone that's a partner at your firm, but I doubt that other partners there are doing doing all the work that you're doing, right? Even for you, Professor Baham, I doubt that other professors at your institution are just, doing all these things, right? And so we always have to work harder. And so we have to think about that and, realize that. And I don't know if the amount of work that one puts in to try to be exceptional should be included in reparations. I don't know, but that's something to consider.
There's an important issue that was raised in the chat, and I just wanted to address it because I don't have the answer. So maybe some of the folks, we got some really smart folks here in the chat. I don't know how to deal with the issue of, and I agree, there's a good case to be made that we should not necessarily be including folks who don't have the common history. And I think that's a valid argument. But I don't know how we can prove this. And what I mean by this, folks who were born in the South, like my mother, who was born in a house along with all of her siblings, some of them can't even find a birth certificate because they weren't born in a hospital. And that's the truth for many Black folks in the South who don't have birth certificates, who were born in houses because they were discriminated against and couldn't be born in hospitals. How do they prove their lineage to African slaves? We know that it exists, but how do you document that? I don't have the answer to that. If there's some good way that we could have a verification system, I don't know. I don't know if it exists. I don't know if the paper trail exists. That's why I said that that wasn't as important issue to me. I think it's an important concept, but practically speaking, I don't know how we prove our connection to Black slavery, to use that as a basis to get reparations. And if somebody,
well, I mean, for my family, it's not going to be super duper difficult. I mean, my mother is from Pennsylvania. My grandfather emigrated from South Carolina, the deep South, to he was part of the Geechee group. I don't know if people on this chat know about Geechee people, but that's where my mother's family comes from. And he would have been maybe around 100. So we put my great grandmother at about 120, 130 years old today. So just going back. So her mother would have had to have been enslaved just by looking at like the timeline of the things, right? My mother was born in 1960. Slavery ended in 1865, technically. Most people weren't free right at that time. So going back, I think that we can try to find, the connections are there. But in terms of, Terrence, to your point about a lack of birth certificates, the lack of documentation, if we are able to get reparations, we can think about, what proofs would be required at the time and who and to whom. But I just thought it was an interesting discussion. And I do want to answer, someone in the chat said that Barack Obama was not a good example because he is not a descendant of someone who was in chattel slavery. The reason why I used Barack as an example is because people say that because we've had a Black president, Black meaning someone who in the context of who is defined as Black in this country, who has more than one drop of African ancestry, he's made it, he was the president for 2 terms. And so people say that racism is over. Racism no longer exists because someone who is considered Black made it to be the president of the United States. So that's the reason. And you also use him as an example because he is exceptional, right? And in order to make it in society and to be successful as a Black person, you must be exceptional. So that's the reason why I used him as an example.
And I guess the bigger point I want to make is I don't want the verification process to prevent us from having a real discussion about reparations. So I don't have the answer. I'm admitting that. I don't have the answer of how we verify everybody's identity. I mean, if I had to verify my own, I'm not sure if I could do that myself. You know, my mom is from the Deep South. My dad is from the Deep South, and I'm sure if I did some digging, I could probably get there. But I'm about as black as you can get, and we definitely are traced back to slavery and somehow. But I don't have any papers to prove all of that.
Terrence, there's on that issue of proof, there's a great historical example in the administration of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the war with Mexico, in which the United States had guaranteed that it would honor the land grants of Mexican landowners. But because those were written in Spanish, they subjected all those landowners to processes of verification, which often meant tying it up in the courts for a long time, which meant that you'd have to keep a lawyer on retainer. And a lot of people started selling bits and pieces of their land just to be able to afford to stay in court. So I think you're spot on that, you know, we have to be careful about things that, and I respect what Dr. Darity has laid out, and people have talked about this in the chat, but I think we also have to be careful, as you suggest, about forms of proof that need to be provided. We can also see, by the way, in our own example, how forms of proof are right now denying many of us the vote.
Yeah, I mean, forms of proof. I mean, preach. That's all I can say to your comment, Professor. I mean, the signature part of the ballot is crazy to me. I attended a training on voting rights the end of last month, and I had no idea that ballots were thrown out if someone's signature that was on file with the voting group or the governmental group, I don't know the proper nomenclature, is different than how you sign your ballot, and signatures change over time. I mean, when I first registered to vote when I was 18 years old, many moons ago, I was signing my name all kinds of crazy ways, and I still sign my name in a crazy way, but it's just different. It's a lot more, it's bigger now, right? So these challenges to voting are really important. I'm so glad that you brought up voting. And again, we're a nonpartisan organization, but we do support everyone's right to vote, and we hope that everyone will educate themselves on who to vote for and what to vote for. But voting is very important. You know, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, and whether anyone likes it or not, there have been several challenges to the Voting Rights Act. And so I'm hoping that we will all be able to vote, and we'll be able to preserve that right.
You know, there's a great comment, if I could address it, from Tony Blount. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Tony has a wonderful proposal for how we could verify folks for the purposes of reparations. And I just thought I would share it because I certainly don't have the answer, but this looks very helpful. So Tony has written, first, an individual must demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. Second, an individual must demonstrate that for at least 10 years prior to the onset of the reparations program or the formation of the study commission, whichever comes first, they self-identified as Black, Negro, or African American. Yeah, we don't want folks who are changing their descriptions just so that they can cash in, and we know a few examples of that. And it says here the first criterion will require genealogical documentation. Again, I don't know how easy or difficult that is, but absolutely no phenotype, ideology, or DNA test. And then he has the second criterion will require presentation of a suitable state or federal legal document that the person declared themselves to be Black. So I'm saying it on video. I'm Black and I'm ready for the reparations. So I'll have this documentation here. But if you look, I'm Black. I'm ready. Anyway, I think he has a wonderful comment. And Ellen and Brianna, if there's a way to save these comments, I'm going to try to copy them and save them. I think Tony has done an incredible job. He even talks about folks who are from other countries and how he would deal with that. So, Tony, thanks for that great comment. I'm going to try to copy and paste this whole thing so that we can make this available. But go ahead.
So,
Adrian.
Terrence,
Oh, go ahead.
Jeanette, there's also a good question in there about whether or not private institutions should be pressured to provide reparations. And my short answer for that is yes. I don't see why not. I mean, there are, if I'm not mistaken, Brown University, a great deal of the seed money for Brown was based on the selling of insurance for slave ships. Again, as Terrence has highlighted here, measurable dollars right there, and dollars that can be sort of evaluated in terms of, you know, what this would look like in a contemporary world. So my answer to that is yes.
You know, I like that we're talking about this, like, you know, the classification and how would we get it? But we need to figure out, there still needs to be a big push for the pot of money, if it's going to be that or the land, right? So we definitely have to be thinking about how the reparations will be distributed, but I think that more advocacy needs to be done because we still are faced with, you know, backlash on the idea for even deserving reparations. So, you know, I'm hoping that the group that the governor has appointed to research will really lay out the claim very clearly and very concisely so that there won't be any question as to whether or not African descendants of slaves, as someone has told me, deserve reparations.
You know, there's also a comment in the chat that that I also wanted to see if, and Terrence and Adrian, if you have an answer to this too. Maureen has weighed in on this, and I like Maureen's comment. But this notion that if we push for reparations, do we become a nation of petty grievances? A couple of things I mentioned in the presentation, that truth telling is an important part of reparations. If telling the truth means the airing of grievances, then so be it. I think it's better than what we consistently do in this country, which is to say, well, it doesn't exist. Let's pretend like it doesn't exist. But when you pretend that it doesn't exist, as for example, we've pretended that mass incarceration and police violence don't exist, I think you can see this summer what happens. It's not as though, you know, you can act like it doesn't exist, but people are living it on the daily. It exists for them every day. They have, you know, I remember even coming up when I was a young person, I think you remember this too, Adrianette and Terrence, how young Black folk used to wear those sort of necklaces with a deceased relative around the neck. And we've had to deal with Black suffering and death for such a long time, and to figure out how we're going to deal with this emotionally. I do agree with Maureen's comment that when we're talking about chattel slavery and the history of Jim Crow segregation and the present history of mass incarceration, hey, those are not petty grievances. And I'm not saying that any other group has petty grievances. I'm just saying that the specific grievances that we are talking about here as African Americans are not petty grievances. The truth has not been told about them. In fact, your president's executive order, and I'm sorry, you guys are nonpartisan, but I'm not. Sorry about that. Your president's executive order specifically states that we are not to even be discussing that. In fact, that whole 1776 versus 1619 project, the pushback on the 1619 project, is about stopping us from telling the truth. So this country still has a deep problem with that. And if we really do tell the truth about this, again, it's not a grievance. We're talking about a legacy well, let me just put it this way. The very soil that we stand on is blood-soaked. There's no question about it. And the country, if we're going to be truthful, this is and has been and remains an anti-Black country that in many cases actually continues to take delight in anti-Black suffering and the spectacle of Black death. I mean, many of us watched George Floyd's murder, and we were in tears, and we were in states of depression for weeks. And yet there were people in this country who posted memes making fun of that. And that was a joke for them.
You know, I agree with everything you said. And I also wanted to clarify, this organization, CLA, is nonpartisan. But I want to make it 100% clear, I am not a Trump supporter. I want that administration gone, and that's in my individual capacity. I just want that very clear. I also wanted to thank Maureen for a great comment in response to the comment, and I won't name that person, saying, you know, turned into a nation of competing grievances. 400 years of slavery and discrimination and anti-Blackness, that's still happening now. We're still being murdered now. We're still being shot in the back now. We still have people putting their knees on our necks now. That's happening now. I'm still getting stopped by the cops now as a Black man. I'm still looking over my shoulder as a Black man. So we're still experiencing this now. I don't think there's anything petty about it. I do realize that we are out of time. It's hard to believe, like, where did the time go? This has been a fun discussion, and we're going to have more discussions. I also want to thank all the folks in the comments. I tried my best to read through as many of these comments as I could. Thank you. You helped to enrich this discussion, and we're going to have more of these conversations, and we're definitely going to invite some of these folks from the comments to join us the next time we have this discussion. And
This is actually a series. So this was part 1 of the series. So we don't have a date set yet for part 2, but this is a series. So please be on the lookout for the next installment of your reparations discussion.
Okay. So I think that will, and Professor Baham, do you have any final thoughts or comments for our guests here?
I just wanted to thank everybody for the intelligent dialogue. And even though there was some disagreement in the chat, the discussions were civil and I think educational, and I think people had a chance to listen and learn, and that's terribly important now, that we really listen to one another.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone who came on a Friday. Thanks so much to CLA. Thank you to the Alameda County Bar Association, Charles Houston Bar Association, and the California Association of Black Lawyers for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you so much, Professor Baham. I appreciate you. And Terrence, you know, we see each other all the time on the internet. So great seeing you again. Thanks so much to Brianna for teching this for us. And thanks so much to Ellen. And again, thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.